The town of Blackwood was the kind of place where nothing truly remarkable ever happened. Nestled between miles of dense woodland, it was quiet. Too quiet, some might say. The streets stretched empty after dark, the air thick with eerie stillness, disturbed only by the occasional rustle of leaves. But on the night of October 17th, something shattered that silence. At precisely 1:42 a.m., a frantic 911 call came through to the Blackwood Police Department. The dispatcher barely had time to introduce herself before a voice, small and trembling, cut through the static. "Please help me." It was a child, a girl. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. She sounded afraid, terrified. "Sweetheart, where are you?" the dispatcher asked, already pulling up the call trace. Silence. Then a faint, muffled sob. "I'm trapped," the girl whimpered. "Inside the house. He won't let me leave." The dispatcher's stomach clenched. "Who won't let you leave?" But there was no answer. The line went dead. Officer Daniel Graves had been with the force for nearly a decade. He had seen his fair share of disturbing cases, domestic disputes, missing persons, even an unsolved murder. But something about this call sat heavy in his chest. The address led him to Raven Hill, a road that wound through the outskirts of town, where old Victorian homes loomed in the darkness like forgotten relics of a past era. The house in question stood at the very end of the street, a towering, decayed structure with boarded-up windows and a sagging porch. As he pulled up, the cruiser's headlights illuminated the peeling paint and the overgrown yard. No sign of movement, no sign of life, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. Then he saw it, a face, small, pale, peering through the attic window, a pair of wide, terrified eyes locked onto his. The girl. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, I've got visual on a child in the house. Requesting backup." A crackle of static. Then, confirmed, nearest unit is 15 minutes out. He didn't have 15 minutes. He moved fast, climbing the rotting porch steps. He knocked hard. "Blackwood PD. Open up." Nothing. He tried again, louder this time. The house stood silent, an unyielding void. Then came the whisper. "Help me." Daniel turned sharply. The voice was close, too close. But no one was there. His hand went to his holster. The front door, despite its decayed state, was locked tight. He circled the house, finding a back door hanging open by just an inch. Darkness stretched beyond, thick and suffocating. As he stepped inside, a sudden boom rattled the walls, the front door slamming shut behind him. Something didn't want him to leave. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something far worse, something metallic like blood. His flashlight cut through the blackness, illuminating dust-covered furniture, shattered picture frames, and deep claw-like scratches along the walls. Then came the footsteps. Soft, barefoot, running, upstairs. Daniel's pulse spiked. "Hello." A muffled sob. A whisper. "He's coming." Daniel's grip tightened around his flashlight as he moved toward the staircase. The wood groaned beneath his weight. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time he reached the second floor, the air was frigid, his breath visible in the dim light. A long hallway stretched before him, doors lining both sides. At the end of the hall stood a single door, slightly ajar. The attic. He moved forward. Every fiber was being screaming at him to turn back. But then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. Daniel pushed open the attic door. The room was freezing. The single window cracked open, allowing the night air to seep in. In the center of the room sat a girl, no older than 10, wrapped in a tattered white nightgown. Her dark hair fell in tangled strands over her pale face. She was shaking. "Hey," Daniel said gently, kneeling down. "I'm Officer Graves. I'm here to help you." She didn't move, didn't blink. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly. "Who's keeping you here?" Her lips trembled. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost inaudible, she whispered, "He doesn't like it when people come inside." Daniel frowned. "Who?" The girl lifted her hand, pointing toward the corner of the room. Daniel followed her gaze. At first, There was nothing, just shadows swallowing the far end of the attic. But then, something moved. A shape, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its body contorted unnaturally, its face obscured by darkness. Daniel's breath hitched. The girl's grip on his wrist tightened. You shouldn't have come. The attic door slammed shut. The light flickered, and the thing in the corner began to move toward him. Daniel's breath turned to ice in his throat. The attic was suffocatingly still, yet the darkness in the farthest corner seemed to pulsate, shifting unnaturally. The girl's small fingers dug into his wrist, her nails ice-cold against his skin. You shouldn't have come, she whispered again, her voice barely above a breath. Daniel wanted to reach for his radio, to call for backup, but something inside him, some primal, instinctive fear, told him that if he moved too fast, whatever lurked in the shadows would lunge. Then it did. A grotesque shape burst forward from the darkness, moving on all fours, its limbs long and unnatural. Its fingers, if they could even be called that, were far too long, ending in jagged, splintered nails that scraped against the wooden floor. The head twitched as if struggling to hold itself upright. And the eyes, God, the eyes. 2 empty sockets, gaping holes that bled darkness itself. Daniel stumbled back, pulling the girl with him. His fingers fumbled for his gun, but the weight of the air, thick and suffocating, made it feel like his arms were moving through tar. The thing skittered forward, its joints popping as it moved in an unnatural rhythm. Then, just as it reached the dim glow of Daniel's flashlight, it stopped and smiled. No lips, just a jagged tear across its face, stretching so wide it almost split its head in two. Run. The girl's voice shattered the silence, shrill and urgent. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed her and bolted toward the attic door, slamming his shoulder into it with everything he had. The wood groaned but held firm. The knob wouldn't budge. Behind him, something scraped against the floor. The thing was moving again. The girl let out a broken sob. He won't let us go. Daniel reared back and kicked the door as hard as he could. The brittle wood splintered, sending them tumbling into the upstairs hallway. The second they hit the floor, the attic door slammed shut with a bang, and the house went deathly silent. Daniel struggled to steady his breathing. The girl clung to him, her small frame trembling violently. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for any injuries. She shook her head, her wide eyes locked onto the attic door. "We need to go," she whispered. He nodded, pulling out his radio. "Dispatch, I need immediate backup at." Static. The radio crackled, the white noise growing louder, turning into a high-pitched screech that made his teeth grind. Then, "Daniel," the voice came through the radio. Cold, hollow, and somehow, inside his head, Daniel's blood ran cold. No one from dispatch had called his name. He stared down at the radio, dread curling around his ribs like a vice. The static deepened, became something else. Breathing. Not his, not the girl's. Something big, something deep within the house. He shut the radio off. "We're leaving. Now." The girl didn't argue. She took his hand and led him down the hall with quick, urgent steps. The old wooden floor creaked beneath them, the very walls seeming to pulse as if the house itself were alive. Then, a low moan rippled through the air. It came from below, the stairs. Daniel stopped cold. The girl's fingers tightened around his. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't look." But it was already too late. Something was waiting for them. Halfway down the staircase, a figure crouched on all fours, its back facing them. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, its skin a sickly shade of gray. The bones of its spine jutted out grotesquely beneath its skin, and it was rocking, back and forth. Slowly, as if waiting, the girl whimpered. The thing twitched. Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs. He took a slow, careful step backward. The floor groaned. The thing snapped upright. Its head turned all the way around, facing them without moving its body. Its mouth split open, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. It screamed. The sound was like nails on glass, an unnatural screech that sent a violent shudder down Daniel's spine. And then it charged. Daniel didn't think. He acted, scooping the girl into his arms. He bolted back down the hall. The walls trembled, the very air thick with an unseen force pressing around them. They burst into a room at the end of the hallway. The master bedroom. Daniel slammed the door shut, locking it. For a moment, silence. Then, boom, something slammed against the door. The girl was crying now, small, muffled sobs. Daniel scanned the room for an exit. The only option, a window. With no hesitation, he rushed forward and shoved it open. The drop wasn't too bad. They could make it. Then the girl's voice stopped him cold. "Wait," she whispered. "Look." Daniel turned, and his stomach dropped. The mirror across the room. It was reflecting something that wasn't there. In its glassy surface, he saw the bedroom, the bed, the window, but there was someone else in the room with them. A figure stood directly behind him. Tall, shadowed, smiling. Daniel spun around. Nothing, but the mirror still showed the thing standing right behind him. Then, in the reflection, it moved. Not toward him, toward the girl. Her eyes went wide. She let out a strangled gasp as something invisible wrapped around her throat, pulling her backward. Daniel lunged. "No!" Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her hands clawing at nothing as she was yanked backward into the mirror. And then she was gone. The mirror shattered, and the house let out a deep, rattling sigh. The moment the mirror shattered, the room fell into an unnatural silence. Daniel stood frozen, his breath ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. The girl was gone. 1 second, she had been there, asterisk, asterisk, clawing, screaming, terrified, asterisk, asterisk, in the next, nothing. Only broken glass and an empty room. His mind screamed at him to do something, to act, to move, but his body refused to obey. The weight of the silence pressing around him, thick and suffocating. Then, from the fragments of the mirror, a whisper slithered through the air. "She belongs to the house now." Daniel's skin crawled. He spun toward the shattered remains, his hands trembling as he reached for a shard. As soon as his fingers touched it, the room changed. The walls twisted, the floor beneath him stretched, and suddenly everything was wrong. The bedroom was gone. The house had shifted. Daniel stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The door he had locked just a moment ago had vanished, replaced by a long, endless corridor that hadn't been there before. Something was wrong with the walls. They pulsed as though alive, shifting slightly like breathing flesh. At the far end of the hallway stood a single door, slightly ajar. From within, the faint glow of candlelight flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows across the floor. And then, a small voice. "Help me." Daniel's blood turned to ice. It was a girl. Her voice was small, weak, distant, but real. He moved. Each step down the hallway felt heavier than the last, as though unseen hands dragged at his legs, trying to keep him from reaching that door. The candlelight flickered as he approached, the shadows stretching toward him like grasping fingers. Then, just as he reached the door, a whisper directly behind him. "You shouldn't have come back." Daniel spun around and saw nothing, only the endless hallway stretching behind him. His breath came fast and shallow, sweat dripping down his temple. His instinct screamed at him to leave, to turn back, but he couldn't. The girl was inside. He pushed the door open. Daniel stepped inside and instantly knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. The room was massive, much larger than it should have been. At the center, an old wooden table was covered in black wax, melted candles arranged in strange, chaotic patterns. Symbols were scrawled across the walls in what looked like dried blood, and, in the center of the room, the girl. She was standing in a circle of black ash, her eyes wide and empty, her body rigid. It was as if something unseen held her there, bound in place. Daniel rushed forward. "Hey, kid, we have to go." She didn't move, didn't even blink. Daniel hesitated, his gut twisting. Something wasn't right. Then he noticed the shadows. They were wrong. The candlelight flickered, but the shadows it cast didn't move like they should have. Instead, they seemed to crawl, shifting unnaturally as though alive. And then the girl's head snapped toward him. Her lips didn't move, but her voice whispered through the air. "It's awake." Daniel barely had time to react before the shadows lunged. A force slammed into him, ice cold and suffocating. The room plunged into darkness. The candlelight snuffed out in an instant. Daniel hit the ground hard, the air forced from his lungs. The shadows wrapped around him like living chains, pulling, squeezing, draining. And then, in the blackness, the breathing, deep, hollow, right next to his ear. A voice followed, low, ancient, wrong. "You do not belong here." Daniel struggled against the unseen force, every muscle in his body screaming, but he couldn't move. The darkness pressed against him, creeping into his skin, whispering things that weren't meant for human ears. Then, a scream. Not his. The girl. Daniel's vision blurred, his mind teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. But he forced himself to fight. With every ounce of strength left in him, he lunged forward, breaking free of the shadow's grip. He reached for the girl, and the moment his fingers touched her, the world collapsed. Daniel hit the floor hard, gasping for air. He was back in the hallway. The girl lay beside him, her breath ragged, her eyes fluttering open. For a split second, relief flooded his chest. Then, a sound, a heartbeat. No, not his. The walls around him shuddered, the wooden planks splitting open as something shifted beneath them. The house. It was alive, and it wasn't done with them. Daniel grabbed the girl's hand. "We're leaving. Now." She nodded, her face pale, but determined. They ran. The hallway twisted, doors slamming shut as they passed, the floor tilting unnaturally beneath them. The house was fighting them, desperate to keep them inside. They reached the staircase, the front door in sight. Daniel didn't hesitate. He charged forward, yanking the door open, and froze. Beyond the door wasn't the outside. It was the attic, the same attic where he had first found the girl. The room was identical, down to the broken floorboards and the single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. And in the center of the attic, a figure, tall, shadowed, smiling. "You never left," it whispered. The door slammed shut behind them. And the house side, the attic door slammed shut behind them, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, his fingers fumbling against the wood, desperately searching for a handle, a knob, anything, but there was nothing, just cold, splintered wood. The girl clutched his sleeve, her small fingers digging into his arm. "We never left," she whispered. Daniel turned back to the room. The attic was identical to the one he had first entered. The same broken floorboards, the same flickering bulbs swaying gently overhead. But there was something different now. The figure standing in the center. It was tall, impossibly thin, its smile too wide, too sharp. The shadows clung to it like a second skin, shifting and writhing as though alive. Its head tilted slightly, watching them, but its eyes were missing. Just empty, gaping holes that somehow felt like they were staring straight through him. "You were never meant to leave," it whispered. Daniel moved fast, grabbing the girl's hand and pulling her behind him. His entire body was screaming run, get out, escape, but there was nowhere to go. The attic had no windows, no doors, only the thing, and then it stepped forward. Daniel's breath hitched as the figure moved toward them, its footsteps making no sound against the wooden floor. The girl let out a small, whimpering gasp, hiding behind him. The thing paused. Its head jerked unnaturally, as if trying to remember something, before it whispered, "You are not the first." Daniel's fingers tightened around the girl's wrist. "What do you mean?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a breath. The thing grinned wider, its mouth stretching impossibly far, the skin at the corners of its lips splitting open like old, dried leather. "This house is hungry." A deep groan shuddered through the walls, the very foundation of the house seeming to shift. Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him, his balance faltering. The girl gasped, clutching onto his jacket. And then the walls began to bleed. Dark, viscous liquid seeped from the cracks in the wood, dripping onto the floor in thick, sticky globs. The smell hit them instantly, Coppery, rotten wrong. Daniel swallowed down the bile rising in his throat. The thing's voice slithered through the air. Many have come before you. And then, all at once, the walls changed. The wooden planks split apart, revealing faces. Dozens, hundreds, screaming faces, pressed into the wood like they had been molded into the house itself. Their mouths were wide open in silent agony, their eyes bulging, their skin melded with the structure. The girl let out a strangled cry, burying her face against Daniel's side. Daniel's mind reeled. His breathing came in sharp, panicked gasps as he stared at the horrific display. And then one of the faces moved. A man, his features gaunt, his skin stretched in over his skull. His lips trembled, and with great effort, he whispered, "Please run." Daniel's blood turned to ice. The house shook violently, as if in anger, and suddenly, the floor beneath them cracked open. Before Daniel could react, the boards beneath his feet collapsed, giving way to a black void beneath him. He fell. The girl screamed, her hand ripping away from his grasp as they were pulled apart. Daniel hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. His head spun as he tried to sit up, the darkness around him thick and suffocating. Somewhere above, the girl's voice echoed, panicked and distant. "Mister, help me." Daniel's chest clenched. He forced himself onto his hands and knees, his head pounding. Where was he? The air down here was wrong. Heavy, thick, and then he realized he wasn't alone. A low, wet breathing echoed in the darkness. And then something moved. Daniel's breath hitched as he squinted into the shadows. Shapes shifted, slow and grotesque, like something crawling toward him. He backed away. A hand, pale, bony, unnaturally long, emerged from the darkness. Then another, and then it spoke. "Do you know what happens to those who enter?" Daniel's blood ran cold. The figure lurched forward, its face finally coming into view. Daniel's heart stopped, because the face was his own. A twisted, decayed version of himself. Eyes hollow, skin sagging, mouth stretched into a grotesque, knowing grin. "You've been here before," the thing whispered. Daniel staggered back, shaking his head. No, I... The thing smiled wider. "You never left." The house let out a long, satisfied sigh, and Daniel screamed. Daniel's own rotting face grinned back at him in the darkness. The decayed version of himself took another step forward, the air around it thick with the stench of death and damp wood. Its mouth twisted into an unnatural shape, the grin stretching far beyond what should have been possible. "You've been here before," it whispered again. Daniel staggered back, his hand scraping against the damp floor beneath him. He was still in the house. But where? The girl's voice echoed from above, faint and distant. "Mister? Where are you? Please, help me." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He had to get back to her. But the thing wearing his face wouldn't let him go. "She belongs to the house," it said, cocking its head to the side. "Just like you do." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. No, that wasn't true. He wasn't part of this. He wasn't supposed to be trapped here, right? But the walls, the whispers, the faces in the wood, all of them had spoken to him as if they knew him, as if he had been here before. Daniel shook his head, forcing himself to stand. "You're lying," he spat. "I just came here today. I found the girl. The thing laughed. A hollow, decayed sound that echoed through the room. "You found her." The house groaned, as if it were laughing with it. And then the memories came rushing back. The girl, the house, the search. Daniel had been here before. Not today, not yesterday, but years ago. He had been part of a missing persons case, a police officer investigating reports of strange disappearances linked to this very house. He had walked in once before, and he had never walked out. The girl wasn't trapped here with him. She was part of it. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, the realization making his stomach lurch. The memories flooded his mind. He had searched his house before, found the same attic, heard the same whispers, and then nothing. Darkness, like a dream that had been erased. Daniel staggered backward, his mind reeling. The girl wasn't a victim. She was a lure. And the house? It fed on people like him. It trapped them, buried them in its walls, erased them from existence, until all that was left were twisted, forgotten echoes of themselves, like the faces in the walls, like the things standing before him, like himself. He had never left. He was never going to leave. The thing lunged. Daniel barely had time to react before it wrapped its fingers around his throat, dragging him down into the darkness. He fought back, thrashing, kicking, trying to break free. But its grip was like iron, its fingers cold as a grave. The house rumbled, walls bending, floors shifting. Hungry, Daniel's vision swam, his air running out. No, he couldn't let it end like this. With every ounce of strength left in him, he reached out blindly, grabbing the first thing his fingers could wrap around, a shard of broken wood from the floor, and he drove it into the thing's face. The creature let out an unearthly scream, its grip loosening as it stumbled back. Daniel didn't waste a second. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the burning in his lungs, and ran. Somewhere above, the girl's voice echoed, but now it was different. No longer scared. No longer innocent. Just smiling. See you soon. The attic door appeared out of nowhere, bursting open in a blinding flash of light. Daniel threw himself through it. And then, everything went black. Daniel woke up gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. He was outside, lying on the overgrown grass of the abandoned property, the decayed house looming behind him. The sun was rising. The night was gone. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Daniel pushed himself up on shaking legs, his body aching. And then he heard it, a soft giggle. His breath hitched. Slowly, he turned back to the house. And there in the attic window, the girl stood staring at him, smiling. Her small hand rose to wave. And as she did, the door behind Daniel creaked open, welcoming him home.